Hello and welcome to this video on the juncture between mathematics and a variety of physical sciences, but in this case biology. This juncture is called the square-cube law. The square-cube law, or various other names such as cube-square law, is simply a mathematical principle. It's applied in various fields, and as mentioned, we're specifically focusing on the role it has to play in biology. It describes the relationship between volume and surface area, generally speaking as a function of a shape's size, whether that's increasing or decreasing. This might seem oddly unique and rather niche for something useful, but once you understand what it is and how it applies, the relevance to life will be obvious. We hope. The square-cube law, or however you wish to name it, is a mathematical principle, and as said, it describes the relationship between volume and surface area as a product of the shape's size increase or size decrease. While this might be how the law works, it can be simplified for our purposes. This principle states that as the shape grows in size, its volume grows faster than its surface area. For example, a cube with a side length of 1 meter has a surface area of 6 meters cubed and a volume of 1 meter cubed. If the sides of the cube were multiplied by 2, so now it is 2 meters long, we would now have a side length of 2, a surface area of 24 meters squared, and the volume would be 8 meters cubed. This example is important as we start with a ratio of 1 to 6 to 1. The ratio then becomes 2 to 24 to 8, or simplified 1 to 12 to 4. The difference does not grow by much relative to the size, or at least not in this example, but it always stays roughly 3 times the surface area to the volume. This is the important point of what we're getting at. The reason the square-cube law, and specifically the ratio, is so important is how it relates to things like the size of an organism, the structure for parts of the body, and more. And just using the two examples of a whole organism and the organs within it, we can see this in practice. For size, we can use the example of our lack of any truly gigantic organisms left in our world. Or at least there are only a few exceptions, and this has not always been the case. There have been multiple periods where life on Earth underwent gigantification, truly monstrously sized organisms. They could do this in part due to the square-cube law. This is perhaps the issue, and where it becomes particularly important. If an animal was to be scaled up, that is, they get just as big in their surface area as their volume, the muscular strength is drastically reduced. This is one reason why the only really living gigantic creatures in the world now are seafaring creatures. The effect of buoyancy counteracts much of this loss in muscular strength. As a result, the square factor of surface area doesn't really get affected by the cube of the volume. This is why the only considerations left are going to be the two major things: cardiovascular function and respiratory function. The increase in volume is a burden on these two in particular. It's why the heart of a blue whale, for instance, is the size of a small car. Then we have flying creatures. There's a reason why pterosaurs don't exist anymore. The sheer amount of weight they would need to bear on their wings would increase exponentially almost, due to the nature of the increase in volume and surface area. They don't gain enough lift from the increase in wing size relative to resistance and mass to make up for that increase. Conversely, it is why something like a fly, due to its very small volume relative to its surface area, will survive being swatted away. The amount of force you impart to it, given its relatively small mass and volume, is not enough to cause it harm. Possibly concuss it, sure, but you won't kill it very easily. This is why fly swatters don't tend to be made out of something solid, but rather are instead made from something that is much more porous. That porosity allows you to get the speed, but not the mass. That imparts force more effectively to the fly. This leads us also to the problem of, well, how do you compare a very small animal to a very big animal? A mouse to an elephant? Well, the reason why we have these comparisons, and to an extent, is largely for exactly the same reasons. The Analysis of an elephant versus a mouse shows that there are huge compensatory mechanisms that have evolved to make up for the square cube law's effects. When you compare them, the sheer amount of difference in what the skeleton of an elephant has to support versus the skeleton of a mouse means the skeleton of the elephant must be immensely stronger. And this is why, as you get bigger, in terms of the organism's whole being, the problems of the square cube become more and more pronounced, versus getting smaller and smaller. After a certain tipping point, the reality is that a creature of a certain size would no longer be able to support its own weight and would quite literally collapse under its own being. As mentioned, many of the current creatures that we know exist and are gigantic largely compensate for this purely by existing in an aquatic environment and having practically no terrestrial counterpart. And in fact, this does play into the other end of this spectrum, which has a certain extent to do with metabolism, or at least that's the example we're going to go with. When we look at the other end of this, that is, rather than looking from the outside in and the issues, we can look from the inside out. That is, what are the advantages of having that large internal volume relative to the surface area? Or conversely, can you use this phenomena to your advantage? To use the human body, and for that matter many other species, our GI tract is made up of the esophageal vessel, the esophagus, or as it may better be known, your pie hole, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and ultimately your anus. The small, and to a certain lesser degree, the large intestine, exemplify the point and benefit in observing the square cube law. Your small intestine is made up of a single long tube. If it was just the tube, the volume and surface area would be static. You would always have that 3:1 ratio. But what if you take that tube and you start to fold it on the periphery? That is, you create pleats or bends in the surface area so it projects into the lumen or middle of the intestine. You no longer have the same surface area to volume ratio. In fact, arguably, the volume doesn't really change as much, but the surface area drastically increases. This is important, as it takes the problem and it flips it upside down. The increase in surface area in a static volume means we can absorb so much more nutrition in the food. The only solution to this, if we didn't rely on the convoluted nature of the intestines, would be if the intestinal length was drastically increased. If you think you've experienced constipation now, imagine how it would be if the dietary fiber you ate needed to travel twice or even 3 times as far. There's also another consideration that sits in between what we've described, and this has to do with diffusion. Now, diffusion can be more or less important, depending on what we're talking about. For example, if we're talking about heat or water, these can be somewhat important, even nutrition to an extent on a microscopic scale. The larger the surface area of a small microscopic organism, like yeast for instance, will be much more difficult if you look at increasing the size of it. That's because the bigger the cell, in the case of microorganisms, gets, the further it has to travel to get to where it's needed inside the cell itself. And this is the problem. You need more work and effort to transport things in a larger object, or organism in the case of this video. And at the other side of that, in order to get rid of material, such as waste from metabolism, you need more effort, time, and certainly longer in terms of the process to expel unwanted material, the larger something gets. This is why the square cube law is not just relevant, but very important to the human body, if not any and all living organisms. It explains a lot of what we do and, to a certain extent, don't see in the world. Why gigantic organisms really only live in water. Why we don't have 10-foot tall giants wandering the world, and if we did, why they probably collapsed on the ground, slowly collapsing under their own weight and dying from suffocation. Why it is that certain microorganisms only get so big and then stop. Why organisms like yeast or bacteria get to a certain size and then divide, rather than continuing to grow bigger. There is a certain evolutionary adaptation based on this square cube law that makes everything make sense. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.